Greetings everyone. This is our third podcast on confusions about the Quran. Today we'll talk a bit about the traditional translations of the Quran versus the philosophy of translation. We'll talk about the types of texts, where a word-to-word translation can be applied and where it can't be applied. We'll also talk about cultural infusions in the interpretation of the Quran that hold the reader from perceiving it in a global sense. We recall from podcast 2 that the Quran is not created just for Muslims. Rather, Muslims are those who understand the Quran primarily as a global message, making sense out of its content. We also established that the Quran does not associate itself with any ethnicity or culture. Being revealed in Arabic language was due to its immediate audience, as said by Surah Yusuf, verse 2, because they were the first to understand it. It represents itself as a natural ideology that can be applied anywhere, preserving the cultural norms of the locality. Hence, the prerequisite to understand the Quran is to observe and discover, which is education. And it's for all human beings. Podcast 2 further clarified from the initial verses of chapter 1 that the Quran is a guidance. It is a guidance only for those who possess the features of staying honest and steadfast for truth, regardless of personal interests, believe on all messengers of God as truthful social reformers, possess a learning aptitude, considering knowledge to be always incomplete and limitless, establish strong connections with God by sharing their means of sustenance with the needy, and believe on accountability for all their acts. Only people possessing these qualities are the audience of the Quran. People out of this definition do not matter. They will not be able to acknowledge its message. A scholarly translation of a text requires the translator to be fluent in both the source and the target languages in terms of syntax, semantics, and culture. In addition, it requires the translator to understand the register of the source text, whether it's a formal text or an informal text, and also the style of the source text, whether it's a political text, an academic text, a business text, or a literary text, and how the translation of a particular phrase or a paragraph should adopt the same or should preserve the same register and style according to the requirements of the target language. They must also understand the core message in the source text, disregarding the cultural infusions, to preserve it in the target language. Hence, a word-to-word translation is required for certain types of texts. For example, legal documents such as passport, education certificates, wills, etc., or medical documents such as blood test reports or a medicine prescription, or universal facts like an earthquake news or a weather forecast or a scientific discovery. Apparently, the Quran talks about all these things at some point. Therefore, there are some sentences or verses that require a word-to-word translation, provided the translator is familiar with the subject of the specific verse. For example, Surah Yasin, verse 40 says, "La shamsu yambaghi laha an tudrika al-qamara وَلَا اللَّيْلُ سَابِقُ النَّهَارِ وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ." Neither the sun can overtake the moon, nor can the night outrun the day. They are all floating in their respective orbits. Now the translation of this verse, specifically of the terms in red, required the translator to be a recognized scholar and researcher of cosmology and astrophysics to explain and demonstrate the depth of these terms to the reader. Only then an ordinary reader of the Quran would get such an in-depth knowledge of what is meant by, for example, the word they, which indicates inclusion of objects other than the moon and the sun. Also, the processes of day and night are different on different planets. A rigorous explanation is required to understand the logic of how God has programmed different objects of the universe in a certain non-linear motion. And that requires the translator to be a subject specialist. At least the translator of these types of verses have to be subject specialists. Literary translation requires dynamic equivalence of the source text, which means preserving the message, disregarding its cultural representations. These include, for example, social texts like religion and philosophy, or it could be fiction and non-fiction, excluding some academic texts like mathematical and science-related concepts that are not culture-based. All these forms need to be represented according to the target language and culture, which are correlated. Again, the translator must be deeply familiar with the subject and the way it is expressed in the target language. Reading mandates discovery, as per definition. And the Quran has consistently advised to read everything with a sense-making attitude. No sense, no meaning. Mind is the first and the most natural distinction as a guide of human beings to accept or reject an idea, provided it is trained with knowledge. It requires deeper thinking and a research-oriented mind. God has created a very mathematical and scientific universe. And as the word Iqra says, which means reading without restriction, extracting a meaning, making a discovery. Learning is doing. Had this been understood, people reading and particularly teaching the Quran would be leading the world in education and research. On the contrary, Muslims are depending on others not only for education and research, but even the basic requirements of a respectful living. This shows unfamiliarity with the Quran. And the third and the foremost advice of the Quran is rather a declaration, La ikraha fid-din, a very well-known verse of Ayatul Kursi in chapter 1 of the Quran, the cow. This means that anything said in the Quran has to be accepted with a free will and understanding. For this, everything must be questioned until the right answer is obtained. Again, this requires the translator and interpreter of the Quran to be expert of the subject that is discussed in a particular place. Subjects raised in the Quran are of three types. Absolute principles, which include universal facts such as the uniqueness of factual knowledge, justice and fairness conditions, leadership behaviors, accountability, compensation and rewards. And there are variants like prayers and fasting, for example, that are dependent on multiple factors for implementation, like geography, health and employment conditions. And there are relativistic principles like marriage and divorce that are applied according to cultural norms, provided justice is served. The later two factors are subject to absolute principles of justice. also, all these principles can be explained only by the relevant experts of the field, which means social scientists, so that if a question arises, they can answer, provided honesty is maintained from both sides, from the teacher as well as from the learner. For example, all kinds of prayers are called salat, as explained in podcast 2, because they show a connection to God. This connection can be built only when one understands God with a free will and believes by heart that God cannot do injustice to any human being. Moreover, the connection is two-sided. Our side of the connection is built by helping the needy according to our own standard of sustenance, as explained in podcast 2. This cannot be done properly without understanding the priorities set in the Quran. All kinds of prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, etc. has no meaning if this connection is not there with understanding provided by relevant experts. Secondly, since God cannot do injustice, any unfair social commandments cannot be associated with God. There must be an error in translation and interpretation, or maybe in the writing of the script. We will bring up many examples from the Quran in the upcoming podcasts that are translated maybe wrongly, sabotaging the whole idea of justice. Lastly, we must be prepared for evaluation and accountability in all personal dealings. The first thing is to justify ourselves if we are doing the right thing. The second thing would be to justify in front of a supervisor, just like we do in our work life. In social life matters, it could be our parents, sincere friends, elders, siblings, even our children. If we can justify our acts to them, we will be able to justify our things to God as well. Hence, we cannot depend totally on translations and interpretations. We have to understand everything honestly and ask questions and get the right answers. At the end of the day, it is we who will be answerable for all our acts. We have to do the right thing, no matter what anyone says or thinks about us. Honesty and justice are the only policies of peace, which Islam means. That's the Quran's one and only message. In this way, past incidents in the Quran can be translated word to word by a professionally qualified translator with an input from historians who have an established research record in that particular area without any discrimination or bias. They could be Muslims, they could be non-Muslims. The prerequisite is to be a truthful researcher and historian. Accordingly, verses regarding the creation of universe, animal and plant sciences must include input by people having established research in the fields of natural sciences with a focus on the particular idea raised in the verse under consideration. The bottom line is, translation and interpretation of the Quran requires involvement of a team of experts in natural sciences, social sciences like linguistics, anthropologists, economists, historians, for example, and behavioral sciences like psychiatrists, psychologists, law, and admin sciences. Current discrepancies about the Quran dividing people into groups are likely to be due to the non-existence of subject matter experts in the translation and interpretation. It therefore becomes more important to ask relevant questions from subject matter experts applying common sense and justice. Anyone who criticizes asking questions is not only unfamiliar with the Quran but also wants others to stay unfamiliar with the Quran. Thank you for being with me. Please feel free to raise questions in the comments and share with people who have a substantial level of knowledge and a thinking mind for a constructive criticism. Thank you very much.